Okay. So after this very concise yet complete overview of Mr. De Backer, I will actually give you some bad news. I will give you a little bit of my observations being a DPO in various organizations and also being managing partner of a company, Apogado, who provides several DPOs and security experts in many organizations. And I will start off by giving you some bad news based on our observations within companies. Now I know the seminar was called Sweet Dreams, something like that, Sweet Dreams or Smart GDPR, Sweet Dreams by Smart GDPR, something like that. So the good news comes after when I'm finished. So please stay at least until I have finished. So the first observation that I made is that actually in general there is a very low level of awareness when it comes to privacy and when it comes to the GDPR in general. People in general do know that something is hanging around, and probably you are not amongst those people, otherwise you would not be here. But in general, a lot of companies do not really realize what is actually going to happen. And for instance, I see that people are not aware of consequences of breaches. People do not know who has access to their data. People actually do also not know what the scope of personal data is. And if you, does this work?
Ja, ik heb een timer opgezet. Een pijltje even gebruiken.
Okay, thank you. So, while if you look into the GDPR, the definition of what is personal data is actually pretty broad. So it's really, it's really very broad. Many people do not realize that. People think that if their information is pseudonymized, it's okay to work with and so on. It doesn't fall under the GDPR, while of course it still does. This has implications on aspects such as your records of processing activities. You also, of course, might have to be able to pay fines. There is a lot of reporting and there are a lot of documentations, obligations to comply with. A second observation that I made is that certainly at this moment, many organizations do not have the necessary authorizations. So with authorizations, currently the Privacy Commission gives you what we call machtigingen, Authorizations, and many people are actually processing information which requires these type of authorizations but do not have it at this moment. For instance, this is necessary if you are processing a national number, the Rijksregister number. People also try to invent a lot of tricks so that this national number doesn't look anymore as a national number, but despite doing that, they forget that they still need the necessary authorizations, which often they don't. So again, there is a big liability, there are penalties. Regarding in the GDPR, actually there is of course no specific mentioning of the national number, because national number is something which a country as Belgium has, but some other countries don't have that. But in the GDPR it is mentioned that our Privacy Commission, the DPA, will get the authority to specify in which case that you need, for instance, a DPO and a DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment. And it is likely that this is going to happen if, for instance, you will be using or processing the national number. A third observation that I made is, it's a little bit related to what Mr. De Backer said regarding consent. Actually, it is that the lawfulness of processing is at least not documented. Probably it's somewhere there, if it is, but it's not really documented. For private organizations, when you're talking about lawfulness of processing, it usually comes down to this consent. There are other reasons, but if you want to do targeted advertising, you want to do profiling, and so on, of course, you do need this consent, which, according to the GDPR, needs to be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And you need to get proof of that. Also, data subjects at any time need to be able to withdraw them from that, which is actually pretty hard to do if you have already been processing the results and so on. So how are you going, if you are drawing statistics, how are you going to do that? I mean, it's not so easy. It's less easy than you might think. And of course, also there are these specific data subject rights, such as the right to object profiling. As I said, there are other bases for lawfulness of processing, but don't count too much on that as a private organization. Fourth observation is that many companies actually make illegal use of data. And with illegal use, what I mostly mean is that actually the data is being reused for other purposes, purposes for which not has been given consent in advance. At the upper left side, you see a very noble example of data reuse. These are examples from the public sector, which are being used actually to fight fraud or to make life of people easier. So that's a very noble use. The example on the right is actually a pretty fishy example. It seems to be legal, but what this site Realo is doing, they are actually reusing open data, giving demographics, and they are then putting this on a map together with real estate ads. So this gives you an idea of how many people of non-Belgian origin are living in your neighborhood. Apparently it's legal, but at least it's a little bit fishy. The example below right is a very tempting example. This is an example of what we call the Dakenscan, energy scans of roofs, which are getting more and more popular in various cities, which gives you an indication of how well your roof has been insulated. Now, this is, of course, very tempting for a taxman to check if your roof indeed has been insulated, if the year before you asked for a subsidy for roof insulation. Of course, the taxman might not be able to do that just like that, but it's still very tempting. And then the final example on the down left side is definitely very illegal. It's an example of a clever guy that developed an app showing, actually taking publicly available yet personal data from two different sources, Facebook and Foursquare, to actually picture the images of nice young ladies and putting that on a map around you, showing where they are at that very moment. The app is called Girls Around Me. Don't look for it, it doesn't exist anymore. So again, for this, you need specified, explicit and legitimate purposes. Your data needs to be adequate, relevant, and so on. Also, as already mentioned by Mr. De Backer, the principle of data minimization. It's a new principle in the GDPR, which is actually pretty hard to obtain for the technical people in the room. You might have heard about database integrity and these kind of things. So basically, it comes down, if you rigorously apply the principles of data minimization to your systems, that actually a lot of your systems might not work anymore, simply because the databases will not be working anymore. So this is not so easy. And then there is also a conflict with several laws, the data retention law, the archive law, there is the only once law, and so on. So to get all that in place, it's not that easy. Fifth observation that I made is that most organizations are not really ready for these data subject rights. And basically, they do know about the rights, but it comes down to the fact that they actually do not know where all the data resides. And in a big company, that's not so easy to know. People have local copies, people might have spreadsheets, people might have drawn their own database, and this independently from the 100 or 200 IT systems that you might already have within your company. Also, there are no proper procedures installed for the data subjects to exercise their laws. Later on, we will have a small demo about a tool that we developed to actually exercise these data subject laws and to govern them. And also, we noticed that a lot of data does not have a proper data owner assigned, and there's also not a real classification and so on. So pay a lot of attention to this. My opinion is that if you keep your records of processing activities, which is an obligation in the GDPR, if you do that in a very, let's say, in a very organized way, that can already help you a lot for that. Remember also there is the right to be forgotten, but there is also in certain circumstances the obligation to forget actually. And again, the question was already raised before, but again, here we also have difficulties with, for instance, archive data, data which is in backups and so on. Also payload data, data which resides in unstructured documents, and Hans will later on explain a little bit how we can actually tackle that kind of problem. Data which is in emails and so on. This is not so easy because it's unstructured data, so not so easy to actually cope with that. What I also notice, or what we also notice, is that there is lack of information security governance. There is often not a real data security policy. There is often not a real information security plan. A risk analysis might be there, but is often very obsolete, or it is pro forma. A DPIA, if any, is also a quite pro forma thing. If you do that, do it well. As you know, a DPIA might be required in certain circumstances. For instance, if you are doing really excessive analysis of data, if processing data is your core business, if you are doing profiling and so on, or in cases when it's imposed by the Privacy Commission, for instance, in case you will be using the national number. If there are high risks, you also need to consult the Privacy Commission, and all that needs to be documented, and of course, for reasons of accountability, you need written proof for that. So please make sure that that is well organized. Seventh observation is that there is often way too much power with way too little people. The 4I principle, which actually means that people who are deciding upon certain data access rights and the people who actually implement these data access rights, the 4I principle says that these people should be different people, so there should be kind of segregation of duties. This is very often not implemented. Certainly when it comes down to system administrators and so on, very often they have way too much rights. This also is the case if you work with subcontractors, if you are using external data processors and so on. Very often, if at all, it is not specified in the subcontracting agreements, or it is very vaguely written down. So if you're doing that, make sure it's in order. Also, if you are writing calls for tender, you're inviting companies to submit you an offer, make sure that all this is very well documented. Also, the principles such as data protection by default are very important in this case. And also, I think, I'm not sure, but I think it's also new in the GDPR, the fact that if your subcontractor is going to subcontract himself to another subcontractor, that this is not allowed without your approval. I believe it's something which is new, and in practice this happens a lot, of course. This really happens a lot. So make sure that also on that point of view that you are following the law. Eighth observation is that there is really a very often very bad approach when it comes down to data protection and data breaches. We all know about hacking, about unprotected cameras, about these kind of things. So I won't go into detail, but it often comes down to a very bad security architecture, or the architecture might be good, but the implementation might be bad. Also, again, I refer here to requests for proposal, to procurement, and so on, which is often pretty bad. And in practice, what I notice is that actually the DPO is involved way too late within your companies. Not in yours, you are here, you are all aware, but in general, the DPO is really involved way too late. It's really often even when the contract has already been assigned, when the project has already been started. Later on, we will also show our methodology to actually avoid these kind of traps, where we actually from the definition of the project already will involve the DPO and ensure that the right information has been captured and processed at the right time. These are a few examples that I experienced myself. I give them in every presentation because these two examples prove that the organization Testaankoop, Testachat, and the organization Electrabel, that they either sold my data or that they had a data breach. Because I used specific email addresses on their sites to register, and now I'm getting ransomware via these email addresses. So don't forget that within the GDPR, data breaches are really taken seriously. There is no such thing as an act of God. God is really not present in the GDPR. So there are no such things. If something happens, even if it's somebody of your company who left a USB stick on the train or whatever, it is your responsibility. There's no act of God. The data principles of data protection by design and by default, I think it really makes sense that they are there, and I think they are very important. Compare it to constructing a house. If you are building a house, you design a house in the way that it is safe. You don't first design a house and then add the safety afterwards. You don't do that. There are a number of instruments available to prevent data protection and data breach. You have the pseudonymization, anonymization, you have encryption, confidentiality, and so on. So there is a lot of things that you can do. Of course, you need to pay attention to cloud processing. That I don't have to tell you. Almost the last observation, that is that in general, the incident management, which will then be used for data breach notification and so on, that this is also pretty bad implemented. It's often very archaic. It often comes down to somewhere the IT service desk, which have a mechanism for reporting data breaches, not realizing that the data breach has actually nothing to do with IT. It's company-wide. It can be something which has nothing to do with technology even. And there are also no formal procedures to handle these data breach. And as you know, in the GDPR, it's very strict what you will have to do, both in respect to the DPA, the Privacy Commission, and to the data subjects. So make sure you have that. And also, what used to be, what still happens from time to time is that data breaches are a little bit covered under the doormat. So that is illegal. You are not allowed to do that anymore. You have to keep track to it, and if indeed there was a serious risk, you have to report it. It's also a matter of good governance, and you need to document all that. Last observation is that very often the DPO is really not a DPO. DPO, or at least it's very badly casted. There might be, maybe there is no obligation for you to have a DPO, but actually if you look into the GDPR, very often you will need a DPO, and almost always, if you are a company of a sustainable size, it is very wise to have a DPO. What I see often is that the DPO is a kind of, if there is an obligation to have a DPO, it's a kind of puppet, somebody who is manipulated by the management, so is not independent, and does not have the qualifications of being able to act independently. Or, on the other hand, that's the easiest way of being a DPO, you play a Stasi officer. You simply are very extremely strict, and you always say, no, this is not possible, no, this is illegal, no. That kind of DPO, playing that kind of DPO is very, very easy. In my opinion, a DPO should have a very constructive role in a company and should be able to help you and should be able to reach you having GDPR compliance, but also should help you to continue to do your business. In the first place, you are a company that wants to do their business. Also, please note there is no fast track to become a DPO. I have seen courses, 4 days, 5 days, and then people follow that. Previously, they have no knowledge at all, no technical knowledge, no legal knowledge, and then they are supposed to be a DPO. Well, I mean, that doesn't work, really. It's very important to have a good DPO. It is often required. It is always a good practice. The DPO needs to be known by your data subjects, and the DPO, as already has been outlined in the Q&A section of Philippe de Backer, the DPO is somebody who has a very well-defined role, and one of these roles are actually to bring your organization to a higher level of compliance. That's my part. Thank you.